Welcome to the Psychology Undergrad.
I am genuinely so excited to be here for this one today because we have a massive and frankly completely counterintuitive mountain of data to get through.
We really do. And for you listening right now, whether you are walking across campus or you're just sitting in the library surrounded by highlighted textbooks, or maybe you're on your commute,
Yeah.
consider this your ultimate peer-to-peer study session.
Exactly.
Today, we are reviewing a massive stack of longitudinal studies and demographic data on the psychology of romantic cohabitation.
Yeah, it's a big one.
It is, because our mission today is to tackle a massive cultural assumption. As psych undergrads, everyone always assumes, and I mean literally everyone in our generation assumes that living together before marriage is the ultimate logical trial run.
Right. It's just accepted as fact.
Totally. It is widely considered a common sense way to prevent divorce. Like,
Yeah.
you test drive the car before you buy it, right? You make sure you are compatible before signing a legally binding contract.
That is the narrative, yeah.
But the data we are about to look at tells a completely different, highly nuanced story.
It really does, and that is exactly the cultural narrative we are dissecting today.
Wow.
To really understand the psychological and sociological mechanisms at play, here we are looking at four very robust sources.
Four big ones for your notes.
Right. First, we have two comprehensive papers from Stanford University sociologists, and they are analyzing the U.S. National Survey of Family Growth, which is often referred to as the NSFG. This dataset tracks demographic data all the way from 1970 to 2015.
These are massive timelines.
It's huge. And then to ensure we aren't just looking at an American cultural anomaly, an American quirk, we are bringing in a rigorous 10-year longitudinal study on German families.
I love that one.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And finally, we will look at a brand new 5-year study that explores the actual psychological reasons couples move in together in the first place and how those specific initial motivations predict relationship survival down the line.
It is going to be an incredible study session, especially if you ever plan on going into couples counseling or clinical practice.
Huh.
But before we dive into the data, I want to share something with you. This show is sponsored by Cozy Earth.
Yes.
Now, as fellow students, we all know that getting good sleep is absolutely crucial for surviving undergrad psych courses. You literally cannot consolidate memory or memorize longitudinal data sets or write a brilliant research paper when you are running on 3 hours of sleep and tossing and turning on scratchy dorm bedding.
It's neurologically impossible.
It really is. That is where Cozy Earth comes in. I want to promote their bamboo sheet set because it will legitimately help give you the best night of your sleep. They are incredibly soft, they are temperature regulating, and just a massive upgrade to your sleep hygiene.
Which is so important.
Yeah, and we know that sheets can be expensive for undergrad, so the discount will really help you get premium sleep on a student budget. Get 21% discount, promo code PSYC101. Just head over to https.susieearth.com/enforcethelovelawed.com.com. Discount PSYC101.
I mean, proper sleep hygiene is a literal cornerstone of cognitive function and emotional regulation. If you are studying relationship dynamics, you know how lack of sleep destroys interpersonal patience. So that is a highly relevant recommendation for any student.
Exactly. A well-rested brain makes for better relationships and better grades. Okay, let's unpack this. We need to start by looking at the historical context of living together, because the societal landscape is completely transformed over the last few decades, and we just can't understand the psychology of today without understanding the sociology of the past.
We really need that baseline.
Right. So if we look at the Stanford analysis of the National Survey of Family Growth data, the shift in premarital cohabitation rates isn't just a gradual trend. It's a staggering demographic explosion.
It's unprecedented, really.
Let me lay out the timeline for you. In 1970, only 11% of first marriages were preceded by cohabitation. By 1980, that number had tripled to 34%.
Just a 10-year jump.
Yeah, just 10 years. By the year 2000, it crossed the majority threshold at 60%, and it peaked around 70% in 2011. It went from a heavily stigmatized fringe behavior to the absolute statistical norm in the span of a single generation.
What is so fascinating here is how the academic world, particularly sociologists and psychologists at the time, reacted to this demographic explosion. As cohabitation skyrocketed, researchers developed what became known as the normalization hypothesis.
The normalization hypothesis, right?
Yeah. And to really grasp why they formulated this hypothesis, we have to look objectively at the historical and cultural forces of the 1970s. Historically traditional religious and moral frameworks viewed premarital cohabitation as a severe taboo. It was routinely and quite judgmentally referred to as living in sin.
And just to pause here for a second, we need to explicitly remind you, the listener, that we are not taking sides on any religious or political morality today.
Absolutely not.
We are not making value judgments. We are merely reporting on how sociologists track shifting cultural norms and how those norms impact human psychology.
Right.
When we talk about living in sin or traditional morality, we are treating those concepts strictly as sociological variables that exert social pressure. We are looking strictly at the data.
Precisely. Our role is strictly analytical here. We are observing the social ecosystem. So going back to the 1970s, because of those strong traditional moral frameworks, there was immense social friction for anyone who chose to live together before marriage.
A lot of pushback.
Right. You could face severe judgment from your family, your community, and your religious institutions. Early scholars observed that couples who lived together during this era had significantly higher divorce rates once they eventually married.
Right.
But they assumed this elevated divorce rate was entirely due to what we call a selection effect.
Right, the selection effect theory.
Yeah.
Which basically argues that because cohabitation was so deeply stigmatized in 1970, the only people willing to endure that societal backlash were highly liberal, secular, non-traditional individuals. They were the rule breakers of their era.
Exactly. The assumption was that these exact same non-traditional individuals, because they were already bucking societal norms by living together, were naturally more open to the idea of divorce if a marriage turned sour.
They weren't trapped by the same rules.
Exactly. They weren't bound by the traditional conventions that told people to stay in unhappy marriages no matter what.
So if I'm understanding the logic of the 70s scholars correctly, they were essentially saying it's not the act of sharing an apartment that causes the divorce. It's just that the type of person who is willing to cohabit in 1970 is also the type of person who is culturally willing to get a divorce in 1975.
Yes.
The behavior didn't cause the outcome, the personality trait caused both.
That is exactly the logic. And that logic leads directly to the core of the normalization hypothesis. Scholars theorize that if the selection effect was the only factor driving the higher divorce rates, then the data would eventually shift.
Because everyone started doing it.
Right. As living together became completely normalized and accepted by mainstream society over the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, adopted by religious and secular people alike, the stigma would vanish. And if the stigma vanished, the pool of people cohabiting would broaden to include literally everyone. Traditionalists, moderates, rule followers, everyone.
It's become standard dating.
Exactly. Therefore, the hypothesis stated that the divorce rates between couples who cohabited and couples who didn't cohabit should eventually converge. They should equalize as the behavior became just a normal part of the process.
But they didn't converge. And that is the massive plot twist in the demographic data. Even as 70% of the population started doing it, and the societal stigma basically evaporated, to the point where your grandparents are probably asking when you and your partner are moving in together, the higher rate of marital dissolution for cohabitors remained remarkably stubborn.
It really did.
It stayed virtually flat across the decades. The gap didn't close. I think a great way for you to remember this concept for your exams or just for your own mental framework is to call it the convergence myth.
The convergence myth, yeah.
The convergence myth is the false assumption that just because an action becomes socially normal and widely accepted, its psychological outcomes will magically equalize. The data proves that social normalization does not neutralize the underlying psychological mechanics of behavior.
This raises an important question. If the higher divorce rate among cohabitors isn't just a byproduct of societal stigma and isn't just a selection effect of non-traditional individuals rebelling against the culture, what is actually happening inside these relationships?
What's going on behind closed doors?
Right. When two people sign a lease together, what is the psychological experience of cohabitation doing to that couple over time?
Well, that brings us to the timeline of a marriage and the really fascinating battle between short-term gains and long-term costs. When we look at the Rosenfeld and Rosler 2019 paper, there is a revelation about the very beginning of a marriage that actually seems to contradict everything we just said.
It does at first glance.
Yeah, in the first year of marriage, couples who cohabited actually have a lower breakup rate compared to those who didn't. It's 3.9% for the cohabitors versus 4.1% for the non-cohabitors.
Yeah.
So initially, it looks like living together does protect the marriage.
Yes, that first year of marriage is crucial to understanding the nuanced mechanics at play here. The researchers identify two competing mechanisms operating on entirely different timelines.
Two mechanisms, okay.
The first mechanism is what they call the practical experience of cohabitation. This is the short-term benefit you just mentioned. When a couple moves in together, regardless of whether they are married or just dating, they are immediately forced to confront a myriad of practical logistical challenges.
Like who takes out the trash?
Exactly. Who takes out the trash? How do we divide the grocery bill? What are our wildly varying standards for what constitutes a clean kitchen? By the time a cohabiting couple actually gets married, they have already negotiated these daily mundane frictions.
They've had those fights already.
Yes, they have a practical advantage in the first 12 months of formal marriage because they aren't simultaneously adjusting to the existential weight of being married and adjusting to the shock of sharing a bathroom with another human being.
Hold on a second, though, because I feel like couldn't you argue that living together and negotiating all those logistical hurdles actually makes you a fundamentally better communicator? Like you learn how to compromise on the thermostat, you learn how to argue productively about whose turn it is to do the dishes.
That's the assumption, yes.
Wouldn't those conflict resolution skills make you a permanently better partner for the long haul?
You would certainly think so. That is the intuitive assumption most people make, that it builds permanent relational skills. But the longitudinal data shows that those practical skills are entirely overshadowed by a different psychological mechanism that develops simultaneously. The practical skills are helpful, yes, but they are relatively superficial. They act as a temporary buffer.
The roommate buffer.
Exactly. The roommate buffer. They've essentially gotten the trivial logistical arguments out of the way, so that first year of marriage is undeniably smoother. But the data shows that this advantage has a strict expiration date.
The curves cross right.
Yes. By year 5 of the marriage, the survival curves on the statistical graph literally cross each other. From year 5 onward, the couples who did not cohabit prior to marriage have significantly more stable unions. Their divorce rates drop while the cohabitors' divorce rates stay elevated and continue to climb.
Because the playing field levels out.
Precisely. The non-cohabitors catch up on the roommate skills by their first anniversary, and once the playing field is level logistically, the deeper psychological differences emerge.
Which brings us to the second mechanism. And I find this one incredibly insidious.
Yes. The second mechanism is termed the cohabitation experience of impermanence. This is the long-term cost. The theory here is that cohabitation, by its very structural nature, is a less institutionalized, less formal relationship than marriage.
Because there's no real boundary.
Right. Living together informally without the explicit public and legally binding boundaries of a marriage subtly teaches the partners that relationships are inherently disposable. It normalizes the idea of an exit strategy.
You could just walk away.
Exactly. It creates a casual framework where the underlying psychological expectation is temporary. Even if you love the person, the structural reality of your living situation is built on a month-to-month lease, metaphorically and often literally. This subtly erodes the foundation of long-term commitment.
That makes a lot of sense.
And when couples eventually transition into marriage, they unknowingly bring that eroded casual framework with them into the marriage.
Let's make sure we clearly define this for everyone listening. An easy common sense memory aid for this dynamic is to think of it as the roommate buffer versus the disposable mindset.
That's a good way to frame it.
The roommate buffer is that practical experience we talked about. It acts as a shield that gets you through the high stress of year 1, which is basically the freshman year of marriage. You know how to be roommates, so you survive the initial shock of domestic life.
Yes.
But the disposable mindset is the invisible psychological toll. It's the ghost that haunts your relationship by year 5, when the logistics of doing laundry are no longer the issue, but the depth of your unconditional commitment to each other is truly tested. The roommate buffer is short-acting, but the disposable mindset is long-acting.
That is a highly effective way to conceptualize it. The practical friction of living together fades as a threat once any couple has lived together for a year or so. The non-cohabitors learn how to share a kitchen by their first anniversary. The buffer wears off.
Right.
But the psychological conditioning of impermanence, the deeply ingrained neurological habit that you can just pack your bags and break the lease if things get too emotionally difficult, that conditioning lingers for years, subtly undermining the marital bond when genuine hardship strikes.
I have to ask, though, if the longitudinal data so clearly shows this long-term risk, if the survival curves cross and non-cohabitors definitively end up with more stable marriages over the long haul, why have we been hearing lately in popular media on TikTok and even in some undergraduate sociology circles that living together is perfectly safe for modern couples?
It's a very prevalent narrative right now.
Yeah, I feel like there was a whole wave of articles recently saying the cohabitation effect was a myth. Where is that narrative coming from?
That brings us to a rather fascinating piece of academic drama. In 2021, Rosenfeld and Rosler actually had to publish a formal peer-reviewed rebuttal paper to address exactly the narrative you were talking about.
Okay, let's get into the drama.
A rival group of scholars, whom we will refer to in this context as MSK, published a paper claiming that the link between cohabitation and divorce had entirely vanished for recent generations. They looked at the same national survey of family growth data and claimed that for the newest cohorts of young adults, the risk was completely gone.
But MSK made a massive statistical error in how they interpreted the timeline, right?
They did. They committed a profound methodological error that Rosenfeld and Rosler term the recent cohort fallacy.
The recent cohort fallacy.
Yes, and to truly understand this fallacy, you have to think critically about how data is collected on recent marriages. If you are a researcher explicitly studying couples who got married in the last 1 to 5 years, the recent cohort, you are by definition exclusively looking at the window of time where the roommate buffer is actively protecting the cohabiting couples. Oh, wow. I see what you're saying. Because MSK was only looking at recent marriages to prove their point about modern couples, they were essentially taking a tiny snapshot of year 1 through year 5.
Exactly.
And in that specific window, cohabitors either have an advantage or are just breaking even. They literally weren't looking far enough down the timeline to see the survival curves cross.
Exactly, because the cohabitors have that initial practical advantage in the first few years. If you restrict your view to only the most recent marriages, it mathematically looks like cohabitation is no longer a risk. It creates a statistical illusion of safety.
That's wild.
But it's an illusion created entirely by truncating the timeline. You cannot measure a long-term outcome by only looking at the short-term data. Furthermore, the rebuttal paper points out something even more shocking.
What's that?
To achieve the result, MSK threw out an astonishing 74% of the valid couple years in the NSFG data. They literally excluded any marriage that had lasted over 10 years from their analysis.
Wait, they threw out 74% of the data?
Yes, that is wild. I mean, even in a basic undergrad stats class, you learn you can't just delete the long-term marriages when you are literally trying to study long-term marital stability.
Yeah.
That feels almost like data manipulation to fit a pre-existing narrative.
I mean, it is highly problematic methodology, to put it mildly. When you discard 3/4 of your data set, you severely reduce your statistical power. In statistics, this leads to erroneous null findings, meaning you fail to find an effect that is actually there.
Because you shrunk the sample so much.
Exactly. For example, MSK relied heavily on a metric called the likelihood ratio test, the LRT. Now, the LRT is a standard measure for comparing statistical models, but with a massive complex data set of over 216,000 couple years, like an SFG, the standard p-value threshold of 0.05 is far too easily satisfied by tiny, insignificant fluctuations in the noise of the data.
Oh, tracking so far.
You can't just rely on the LRT in a dataset this large. You have to use the Bayesian information criterion, or BIC, because the BIC formula, which is the negative LRT plus the natural log of n times the degrees of freedom, aggressively penalizes unnecessary complexity in a model. So that
Okay, hold on. I'm going to stop you right there.
Yeah.
I love it when you get fired up about the math. I really do. But I'm looking at my notes right now, and my eyes are glazing over at a natural log of n.
Fair enough, fair enough.
Let's pull back and translate this into an analogy for those of us who haven't taken our advanced graduate statistics seminars yet. Help me visualize the difference between the LRT and the BIC.
Okay, yes, I can get a bit overly enthusiastic about the modeling. Let's use an analogy. Imagine you are installing a fire alarm in your kitchen. The likelihood ratio test, the LRT, is like a hypersensitive, cheap smoke detector. It goes off if you burn a piece of toast, if you boil water too vigorously, or if someone vapes in the next room. It detects every minor fluctuation and calls it a fire.
So it's basically crying wolf.
Exactly. Now, the Bayesian information criterion, the BIC, is a smart, advanced fire alarm system. It takes in multiple data points, penalizes the trivial smoke from the toaster, and only goes off when there is an actual structural fire. MSK used the hypersensitive alarm, so they found significance in random noise, and they chopped off the most important part of the data, the long-term marriages.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. The BIC filters out the noise. And so when Rosenfeld and Rosler put the 74% of the data back in, and they use the smart fire alarm that ignores the random statistical noise, what happened?
The historical truth reappeared instantly. The risk of cohabitation has not vanished for recent generations at all. It has remained stable and persistent for decades.
Wow. And wasn't there another massive flaw in how MSK looked at children in these households?
Yes, there was a glaring oversight regarding premarital fertility. The historical data shows that 25% of premarital cohabitors in the sample had a child before marrying their partner. Compare that to only 7% of non-cohabitors who had a child before marriage.
That's a huge difference.
It's a massive difference. Now, logically, having a child creates a powerful, tangible, structural barrier to breaking up. You are bonded by this child, you share custody finances and deep emotional ties, making it profoundly harder to separate even if the relationship is failing.
Right. You can't just walk away easily.
In their statistical models, MSK treated the presence of children as a time-invariant variable, meaning they treated it mathematically as a fixed characteristic that doesn't change or exert dynamic pressure over the course of a relationship. By masking the profound difference in premarital childbearing between the two groups, MSK accidentally skewed the math to make cohabitation look structurally safer than it actually is.
They confuse the variables.
Yes, they confused the stabilizing force of having a child with the stabilizing force of the relationship itself.
Let's just sit with that for a second. To summarize the academic drama for your notes, if you ignore the long-term marriages, if you use a hypersensitive statistical test that reacts to noise, and if you miscalculate the massive impact of having kids before marriage, sure, cohabitation looks perfectly fine.
On paper, at least.
Right on paper?
Mm.
But when you look at the whole unedited picture with rigorous methodology, the long-term risk of divorce is undeniably still there. Here's where it gets really interesting. Because the risk of divorce we've been talking about isn't just about the specific person you ultimately marry. It's heavily influenced by the people you lived with before you met your spouse.
This is a critical distinction in the sociological literature, and it's where the psychological implications become very stark. We have to clearly define our terms here. When sociologists use the term premarital cohabitation, they specifically mean living with your future first husband or wife. You live together and then you marry that specific person.
Got it.
But non-marital cohabitation refers to living with previous partners, ex-boyfriends, ex-girlfriends, or ex-partners whom you did not marry. You lived together, the relationship ended, and you moved out.
Let's look at the numbers on this, because the odds ratios from the data are just, well, they aren't a statistical rounding error. They are massive red flags. Let me read these out. Women who cohabited only with their eventual husband, meaning strictly premarital cohabitation, had a 1.19 times higher odds of marital dissolution compared to women who never lived with anyone before marriage.
So a 19% increase.
Right, so a 19% increase. That is a risk, but it's a relatively modest one. But two women who had just one non-marital cohabiting partner, one live-in ex, had 3.25 times higher odds of divorce in their future marriage.
It's a huge jump.
And if a woman had two or more previous live-in partners, the odds of her future marriage ending in divorce skyrocketed to 4.66 times higher.
Those numbers are staggering, and they perfectly illustrate the two mechanisms we discussed earlier. Let's apply the framework. Think about the practical experience of cohabitation, the roommate buffer. That practical experience is strictly partner-specific.
Meaning it doesn't transfer over.
Exactly. Learning how to share a bathroom, split the grocery bill, or fold laundry with your college boyfriend does absolutely nothing to help you navigate chore division with your future husband 5 years later. The practical logistical benefits do not transfer from one relationship to the next because every human being has different logistical quirks.
Right. I'm not sure I fully buy that you learn literally nothing, but I see the point. Knowing that your ex liked the thermostat at 68 degrees and preferred to do dishes in the morning doesn't help you with your new spouse who runs cold and does dishes at night. The data resets.
Exactly. The practical skills reset. However, the experience of impermanence, the disposable mindset, absolutely does transfer. In fact, it doesn't just transfer a compound.
It builds up over time.
Every single time a live-in relationship ends, the psychological expectation that relationships are temporary solidifies deeper in your psyche. Think about the trauma and the logistics of a breakup when you live together. You pack up your boxes. You literally divide your shared belongings, you untangle your shared finances, you physically move out, and your brain learns neurologically and psychologically that the deepest levels of shared domestic life are, in fact, easily severable.
You prove to yourself that you can leave.
Right.
Right.
If you go through this process 2 or 3 times in your 20s, by the time you actually get married, your psychological threshold for exiting a shared living arrangement is incredibly low. The impermanence has stacked up. You have built a neurological pathway that says, when things get hard, I pack my bags.
If we apply this to modern dating, it is actually quite alarming, especially for our demographic. If you end up doing couples counseling in your future practice, this is the exact demographic you're going to see sitting on your couch. Yeah. Think about being a young adult right now in an expensive city like New York or San Francisco or London or Toronto.
Oh, the housing markets are brutal.
Serial cohabitation is highly normalized simply as a way to survive the housing market. I know so many people who move in with a partner after 8 months just to save on rent because having roommates is exhausting.
It's an economic reality.
Yeah. The relationship naturally runs its course. After 2 years, they break up, and they do it again with the next person to afford a new place. Young adults are treating cohabitation as an economic life hack. But the data suggests they're unknowingly compounding massive psychological risks for their future marriages. They are building a deeply ingrained, disposable mindset just to afford a one-bedroom apartment.
That economic driver is very real and impossible to ignore. But to ensure that this phenomenon isn't just an American cultural quirk, perhaps driven by unique American economic pressures, the lack of a social safety net, or lingering puritanical stigmas about living in sin, we have to look across the Atlantic.
We need to see if it holds up elsewhere.
Right, we need to see if this psychological mechanic holds true in a completely different cultural ecosystem.
Which brings us to a fascinating 10-year study out of Germany. In 2021, researchers tracked 220 German families over a full decade, starting when their children were preschool age and following them all the way into adolescence.
Germany is the absolute perfect test bed, effectively acting as a control group for the societal stigma hypothesis. In Germany, especially among younger cohorts, non-marital cohabitation is highly accepted, widely practiced, legally supported, with strong social safety nets, and virtually free of the social stigma you might find in more traditional pockets of the United States.
It's just a normal way of life there.
In fact, many Germans view long-term cohabitation as a fully equivalent permanent alternative to formal marriage, not just a stepping stone or a trial run. So if the negative outcomes of cohabitation were purely driven by social stigma, by feeling judged by your church or your community, then those negative outcomes should simply not exist in the German sample.
But the results mirror the U.S. data almost perfectly. Despite the complete lack of societal stigma, the German cohabiting couples faced significant long-term challenges. The study found that cohabiting mothers who managed to stay with their partner over the entire 10 years showed significantly greater declines in relationship adjustment compared to married mothers.
And we should clarify what relationship adjustment means in this context. It refers to a comprehensive metric measuring relationship satisfaction, dyadic cohesion, which is how well they work together as a team, and the frequency of consensus on major life issues.
So the overall health of the connection.
Right. Even when the cohabiting relationship physically survived the decade, the internal quality of the connection eroded faster and more severely for the cohabitors than for the formerly married couples.
And the impacts extend beyond just the couple to the next generation, which is where this gets really serious. The study tracked the children into adolescence and found that the teenagers of cohabiting parents were at a significantly higher risk for externalizing symptoms a decade later compared to the adolescents of formerly married parents.
That's a huge finding.
It is. And by externalizing symptoms, we are talking about behavioral issues, aggression, delinquency, or acting out in school.
That is a highly critical finding for any psychology or sociology student to understand, because traditional moral arguments have claimed for centuries that formal marriage inherently stabilizes children. And here we have rigorous, completely secular psychological data from a highly progressive, secular European country suggesting that there is an intrinsic structural difference between formal marriage and informal cohabitation.
It's not just a piece of paper.
Exactly. It impacts relationship erosion and adolescent mental health, entirely independent of whether society approves of the arrangement or not.
So it's not about being judged. It's about the structure itself.
Precisely.
Yeah.
It implies that the formal institutional boundaries of marriage, the explicit public vow of permanence, provide a psychological container that fosters long-term security. Without that explicit container, the ambiguity of cohabitation, even in a supportive society, seems to generate a low-level chronic instability.
The kids pick up on that.
They do. The children, subconsciously or consciously, pick up on the fact that the foundational relationship of their home is structurally contingent, not permanent. I should note, however, to be completely thorough with the data, the German study did find one major protective factor.
What was that?
The single greatest predictor for a couple staying together and maintaining relationship quality over the 10 years was the mother's report of better initial interparental communication. So strong, healthy communication skills at the outset can mitigate some of the risk, but the structural vulnerability of cohabitation still remains a significant baseline challenge.
So if the long-term data from Stanford is daunting and the cross-cultural data from Germany shows structural vulnerability, what does this all mean for why people move in together in the first place? If it carries this much risk, what is driving the initial decision?
That's the core question.
That brings us to the Chapman 2025 study, which I think is my favorite piece of research we are looking at today.
Yeah.
This is a brand new 5-year longitudinal study that asked couples a very simple, direct question right as they were packing their boxes and moving in together. They asked, "Why are you doing this?"
The Chapman study is brilliant in its simplicity and its depth. It categorizes the complex motivations for moving in together into 3 main buckets. First, you have intrinsic reasons moving in together simply to spend more time with the person you love. It's driven by desire and connection.
The romantic reason.
Yes. Second, you have doubt-based reasons moving in together explicitly to test the relationship because you aren't sure if it will work out long term. You are looking for data. And third, you have external reasons moving in together out of convenience, which is usually financial, like saving on rent, shortening a commute, or escaping a bad roommate situation.
The results of the 5-year follow-up are incredibly revealing. Couples who moved in together specifically to test the relationship predicted a much higher likelihood of breaking up and reported significantly worse overall relationship functioning over the next 5 years.
Which is very telling.
On the other hand, couples who moved in intrinsically simply to spend time together predicted much better functioning. And, fascinatingly, moving in for convenience, the whole saving on rent thing predicted basically nothing. It was a neutral factor. It didn't help, but it didn't inherently hurt.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the most crucial finding of the Chapman study is about the trajectory of the relationship over time. The researchers found that the reasons for moving in together don't actually change the slope of the relationship's decline after the move. The slope is mathematically the same for everyone.
Wait, so what does change?
What the initial reasons dictate is the starting line.
Let me make sure I'm following this because I want everyone taking notes to get this right. You are saying that almost all relationships experience a slight decline in pure, unadulterated excitement or functioning as they settle into mundane domestic life. The honeymoon phase ends. The slope of excitement goes down a bit for everyone regardless of why they moved in.
Correct. As the novelty wears off and the reality of shared chores sets in, there is a natural, universal, slight decline in reported functioning. But the people who move in to test the relationship start with much lower relationship quality on day one. They are already harboring significant debts. They are already looking for flaws.
This is starting from a deficit.
Exactly. So as they experience that normal universal decline in functioning over the next 5 years, the testers hit the breaking point much faster because they started so close to the bottom of the graph. It is a classic selection effect. The reason for moving in reflects the pre-existing health and security of the partnership rather than the act of moving in creating a new dynamic.
This leads perfectly into a concept that every psych undergrad absolutely needs to know. Inertia theory, often described in the literature as sliding versus deciding.
Yes, sliding versus deciding.
I love the analogy for this. Let's build out a scenario. Imagine you are living in Brooklyn. Rent is $3,000 a month, and you are dating someone you aren't entirely sure about. You have some lingering doubts, maybe you argue a bit too much, so you say, let's live together to test it out. If it works, great. If not, we break the lease.
A seemingly rational, low-risk proposition.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But it's a trap. Suddenly you move in. You don't just share a lease. You accidentally buy a $2,000 West Elm sectional couch together. You adopt a highly neurotic rescue greyhound named Barnaby. You share a Wi-Fi bill, a Netflix account, and all of your friend groups have seamlessly merged.
You're fully entangled.
A year later, you aren't actually any more in love with this person than you were on day one. In fact, your doubts are still there. But breaking the lease, dividing the expensive furniture, figuring out who gets custody of Barnaby, and untangling your entire social life is just too logistically exhausting and emotionally devastating.
So you stay.
So you don't break up. You slide into an engagement because that's the next logical step.
Right.
And then you slide into marriage simply because the sheer inertia of your shared life makes breaking up too difficult. You didn't actively decide they are the absolute love of your life. You just slid down the path of least resistance.
That is the insidious nature of the inertia theory. The structural constraints of living together artificially inflate the lifespan of a relationship that, under normal dating circumstances, would have naturally and cleanly ended. You become trapped by the logistics of the West Elm couch and the rescue dog.
Right.
When couples eventually marry due to inertia rather than active intentional decision-making, they are bringing profound underlying weaknesses into a legally binding institution.
And that gives us our final memory aid for the session, tying it all together. The trial run trap. You move in thinking you're just taking the car for a harmless test drive. You think you are being a rational modern dater. But because of the inertia theory, you actually accidentally buy the car. Because handing the keys back involves way too much paperwork, emotional distress, and logistical nightmares.
Is the perfect way to put it.
The trial run is a trap. It forces a commitment level that the emotional bond hasn't actually earned yet.
It is a profound psychological trap.
Yeah.
We approach modern relationships with this hyper-rational, risk-averse mindset. We want guarantees. We want data. We think if we can just simulate marriage through cohabitation, we can eliminate the risk of divorce. But the data unequivocally shows that the simulation itself alters the variables.
Okay, we've covered so much ground today, from the 1970s stigma to German adolescence to the inertia theory. For you listening, taking notes, let's crystallize the big takeaways. First, while living together before marriage offers a short-term roommate buffer that makes the first year of marriage logistically easier. It carries a deep, long-term disposable mindset risk that erodes the foundation of the relationship by year 5.
Yes.
That risk compounds dangerously if you have serial live-in partners because you are actively training your neurological pathways.
Yes.
That domestic bonds are temporary and easily severable. Furthermore, if you're using cohabitation specifically to test a rocky relationship, you are almost certainly falling into the trial run trap, setting yourself up for the structural inertia of sliding versus deciding. The data is overwhelmingly clear. Cohabitation is not the safe, logical, foolproof scientific experiment culture tells us it is.
And I will leave you with a final thought to mull over before your next seminar, or simply as you navigate your own relational life. We treat cohabitation as a logical scientific experiment, a trial run to gather empirical data on our partner before committing. But humans aren't laboratory variables, and homes aren't controlled environments. What if the very act of leaving the back door open, keeping an exit strategy viable, fundamentally changes the psychological nature of the home you're trying to build? Can you ever truly test unconditional commitment conditionally?
That is exactly the profound question we need to be asking as future clinicians and as people. Thank you
Sure.
so much for joining our peer study session today on the Psychology Undergrad. Don't forget, if you want to optimize your sleep so you can actually remember all this data for your next exam, use our Cozy Earth promo code PSYC101 for that 21% discount. Get some rest, review your notes, and we will catch you in the next deep dive. Goodbye.